I was finally on my way out. I had my new apartment, the hearing with the committee was coming up. For years I had been crying in the basement of my parents' home. One time my mother walked past me on her way to the bathroom. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself," she said. I answered, "If I don't, then who will?" That silenced her completely. When I was leaving, they came. "Don't do it," they said. "Come back." My big sister came and said the same. I looked at her and said, "Why does everyone come when it's too late?" Not one of them repented, not one of them said they were sorry. But a colleague at work, some months before, said something I had never heard from a fellow Christian. "We love you just the way you are. Not we love you when you change, just as you are, right now." For someone who had spent years trying to earn belonging, that was revolutionary. And she was an outsider, according to everyone I had just decided to leave. She personified the message they said they were preaching. That's when I knew I was in the wrong place. What made me leave wasn't hate. It was an unrequested sign of care. Hi and welcome to God is My Guru. It has been many years since I left. It has taken a long time and a lot of mistakes to get to where I am now. That is perhaps why I keep returning to the text itself. Not to what I was taught it said, but to what it actually says. And perhaps why I keep returning to the stories like Jehoshaphat, Joash, Abraham, and Moses. Because in those stories, God keeps meeting people before they have fixed themselves. Not because they were perfect people. In the last episode, Abraham asked God, "How can I know?" And God didn't ask him to prove anything. The burden of proof was never Abraham's to carry. So far, we have learned that God comes looking for people who are hiding, and that when he makes a promise, he doesn't leave you to carry it alone. But if you always carried everything yourself, then you might wonder, why would he do that for me? Maybe you spent years looking at other people and thinking, they're the ones God would want, the faithful ones, the confident ones, the people who seem to have their lives together. It's almost as if you're sitting in the waiting room, going over it one more time. And somewhere under all that preparation, there's a smaller voice running its own commentary. Not about the job, about you. They're going to see right through you. You might not get it. You think about the way the wrong words come out, right when it matters most. The impulsive choice you're still working through 3 days later. Why would they pick someone like that? If that's recognizable to you, then perhaps there's a person in the Bible you can relate to far more than you ever imagined. A person who felt exactly that way. Imagine you're the one doing the hiring. You need to send someone into the most important meeting of their life. Someone who will represent you. Someone who will speak on your behalf. Who would you choose? A leader? A speaker? Someone with nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Now raise the stakes as high as they go. You are going to send someone to stand in front of the most powerful ruler in the ancient world, Egypt's throne room. Who would you send? God sent an 80-year-old shepherd, hiding in the wilderness, running from a warrant Pharaoh himself put on his head. Why him? That's exactly what he wanted to know too. Too impulsive? Moses. Said the wrong thing at the worst moment? Moses. The story usually gets told as if Moses was some kind of hero waiting in the wings, a leader in training, a prince who just needed the right moment. No, Moses was raised as a prince in Pharaoh's house. That much is true. He had power, he had privilege, he had access. But he grew up knowing exactly who he was. His mother nursed him in the palace, and while she did, she made sure he knew where he came from. He knew about the slaughter of the Hebrew children. He knew the people suffering in the fields were his people. So when he saw the abuse, he acted, not for himself, for them. It ended in a man's death. And the people he had defended, the ones he had risked everything for, turned on him the next day. They didn't see loyalty, they saw a threat. He fled, not just from Pharaoh, but from the people he had tried to protect. He ran all the way to Midian, married a shepherd's daughter, had a kid, and then spent 40 years tending his father-in-law's flock. That's not a gap year, and not even a sabbatical one. This is a man who has disappeared. He's not looking for anything and he doesn't want to be found. He's just keeping low. You might know what it feels like to lower your expectations, to decide that this is probably as much as life is going to give you. 80 years. By any reasonable measure, the story is over. That's where we find Moses, and that is when God comes looking for him. A bush that is burning but not being consumed. He turns aside to look, and that small decision, that single turn, is where everything changes. A voice speaks from the fire. I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard them cry. I know their pain. I am sending you to Pharaoh. You will bring my people out of Egypt. If you remember God's promise to Abraham, where he said he had to wait 400 years, this is almost 400 years later. Moses answers immediately, not with enthusiasm, not with gratitude, but with a question. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? God doesn't answer the question. He redirects it. He says, I will be with you. Moses tries again. What if they ask your name? What do I tell them? God answers, I am who I am. Moses keeps going. What if they don't believe me? What if they don't listen? God gives him tools to use. Moses is not finished. He says, I have never been eloquent. I'm slow of speech. You might know this feeling. The words that never came out at the right moment, and you drove home replaying what you should have said. The very weakness Moses' name was accommodated. His brother Aaron would speak for him. But still, Moses makes one final attempt. Please send someone else. And here the text says something that most sermons I ever heard skipped entirely. It says God's anger burned against Moses. God had run out of patience with the objections, and he sent him anyway. Moses doesn't walk away a different man. There's no transformation happening at the bush. He walks away with the staff in his hand and an assignment he didn't want, toward the country he fled, to face a man who wants him dead. Nothing about his circumstances has changed. Nothing about his record has changed. God doesn't wait for Moses to feel ready. He simply says, I will be there. There's an entire industry built on the idea that the problem is what you believe about yourself. Believe differently and your life follows. Visualize success. Repeat the affirmations. Tell yourself you're capable until you feel it. The assumption underneath all of that is confidence comes first and results follow. The Bible is not particularly interested in that sequence. When you read the Bible, you find something else entirely. Abraham says, how can I know? Jehoshaphat says, we don't know what to do. Moses says, who am I? These are not people who started with belief. They started with honesty. And in none of these stories does God respond the way a motivational speaker would. He doesn't say, you're amazing, you got this, believe in yourself. What he says to Moses is, I will be with you. The answer to, who am I, is not a better opinion of Moses. It's a promise of presence. This is not the same voice as in episode 5, the one that talks you into things, the one that sounds like relief and pulls you towards something you already know you shouldn't reach for. This voice is the opposite. It doesn't pull you toward anything. It keeps you from reaching at all. It doesn't say yes when it should say no. It says no when it should say yes. This voice shows up in job interviews, in relationships, right when something good is finally happening. It can hit you right before an important event. In Egypt, it sounded like a Hebrew man saying, who made you ruler over us? In the wilderness, it sounds like Moses' own voice, alone, with nobody left to blame it on. Same verdict, different mouth. Once you know the shape of it, you can recognize it the second time, the fifth time, even when it's wearing something new. Moses' objections at the bush are not anxiety about an unknown future. They are a report on a known past. Who am I is not a question, it is a conclusion. Every objection he raises is grounded in something real. What if they don't believe me? They didn't believe him before. He's not being dramatic, he's being honest. But honesty is not the same thing as completeness. Moses knows what he has done. God knows what he can become. The thing Moses lacks is not awareness of his failures. The thing he lacks is awareness of his own capacity. And that is what God supplies. Moses sees a failed rescuer. God sees a future deliverer. The evidence in Moses' past is real. The verdict Moses drew from it was his own. The conversation is never about Moses' qualifications, not his past, not his failures, not his worthiness. The conversation is about God wanting Moses and God coming with him. Most people who have walked away from something, a church, a family system, a version of themselves they were told to be, carry a verdict they never formally accepted but stopped questioning. Someone named them at the wrong moment, with enough authority behind it that challenging the conclusion felt pointless. Why bother? So they left. And first, leaving felt like freedom. What they didn't see was that the verdict came with them, quietly integrated, operating in the background, shaping what they reached for and what they didn't. Freedom wasn't in the leaving. It was waiting on the other side of a question they hadn't asked yet. You have lived with a conclusion someone else made long enough that it started to feel like the truth. Even on a subconscious level, it stopped feeling like a verdict and started feeling like just the way things are. But evidence and verdict are not the same thing. Someone looked at the same record and saw something you didn't. You don't have to believe that yet. But it's worth knowing that the verdict you have been living under, the one that tells you who you are and what you're capable of, was never meant to be the final word. The man who would later stand on Mount Sinai and say, "You shall not murder," is the same man who once buried a body in the sand. And God still isn't talking about it. But God isn't finding out this as he goes. He already knew about the Egyptian in the sand. He already knew about the 40 years of hiding. None of it is new information. What if before you even decide to talk to God, he already knew your worst parts, and the conversation he wanted to have with you had nothing to do with any of it? The past was never designed to close the case. Moses carried a belief about himself for 80 years by the time God met him at that bush. God didn't dispute a single item of it. He didn't ask Moses to forget what he had done, or pretend it didn't happen, or manufacture a confidence he didn't have. He simply refused to let that belief be the last word. And Moses goes. He walks straight from that desert into Egypt, into Pharaoh's court, into the confrontation he had been hiding from for 40 years. The boldness doesn't come first. It grows through the journey, through every plague, every setback, every time he steps forward and finds that God is still there. Think about it this way. When you're in 3rd grade, the 6th graders look enormous. Their approval matters. Their presence can make your stomach tighten. Then your teacher shows up and walks with you, and it gives you courage. 20 years later, you walk past the same age group. They're just children. The 6th graders didn't change. You did. But it did help that someone was showing up in that difficult part when it still felt scary. That is how children learn. That is how apprentices learn. That is how trust grows in relationships. Someone showing up when it counts. The prince who ran from Egypt and the shepherd who returned to it were not the same man, which means Pharaoh had nothing left to offer him. God does not require confidence before he shows up. He shows up first. Confidence comes later. A manager says, "Do the job." A friend says, "I'll come with you." Moses never pretends. He tells God exactly who he thinks he is. The entire conversation is honest, and that honesty is the starting point rather than the obstacle. God is not nearly as threatened by honesty as people are. Moses spends the entire conversation disagreeing with God's choice, and God never changes his mind. Somehow that wasn't the thing God was looking at. So if it wasn't Moses' past, Moses' confidence, or his eloquence, then what exactly was God looking at? I'll see you in the next episode.